Have you ever wondered why some workplaces feel like high school drama all over again? Research shows that 85% of employees experience significant workplace conflict due to hidden psychological patterns we're about to explore.
That's such a striking statistic, and it really connects to these fascinating patterns identified by Wilfred Bion about how groups behave unconsciously in organizations.
Well, what's really interesting is how these patterns show up in three distinct ways. And let me ask our listeners to think about which one they've experienced. Dependency on leaders, fight or flight responses, or forming exclusive alliances. Take a moment to reflect.
You know what's wild about these patterns? They operate completely beneath our awareness, like an organizational subconscious.
Exactly right. And studies show that organizations lose up to 30% of their productive time due to these unconscious dynamics. Let's start with the dependency pattern, where people essentially transform their boss into a parent figure.
Oh, I've definitely seen this. Like when entire departments become paralyzed without explicit direction from their leader.
And here's what's fascinating about dependency. Research indicates that roughly 60% of employees regularly defer decisions they're actually authorized to make. They'll say things like, "I need to check with my supervisor even for routine matters."
So, what makes this pattern so persistent in organizations? Why don't people just recognize it and break free?
Well, that's where the psychology gets really interesting. These patterns actually serve as collective defense mechanisms against workplace anxiety. Think of it like a corporate security blanket. Not very effective, but emotionally comforting.
That makes me think about the fight flight pattern, which must be equally draining on organizational resources.
Exactly. Studies show that companies with high levels of departmental rivalry spend up to 40% more on redundant processes because teams refuse to share resources or information. Like, imagine having two departments buying the same software because they won't collaborate.
And I bet this connects to what you mentioned earlier about high school dynamics, the whole us versus them mentality.
You know what's really mind-blowing? These patterns are so powerful that even when people are aware of them, they still fall into the trap. Let's pause and think about why that might be.
Well, that certainly explains why some organizations seem stuck in these destructive patterns despite countless team building exercises and consultants.
And then we have the third pattern, pairing, which research suggests is particularly prevalent in tech companies, where about 45% of major initiatives arise from exclusive two-person alliances rather than broader collaboration.
That's fascinating because it suggests these patterns aren't just about avoiding negative emotions, they're also about how people try to create positive change, even if it's ultimately counterproductive.
Here's something to consider. These patterns actually create a sort of organizational immune system. When anxiety levels rise, these defensive routines kick in automatically, just like antibodies fighting an infection.
Though, unlike our actual immune system, these organizational defenses often end up hurting more than helping.
So let me ask our listeners to consider this final question. In your workplace, which of these patterns seems most dominant? Think about how it might be affecting decision-making and collaboration.
That's such a powerful way to frame it, making these invisible patterns visible.
And here's our key takeaway. Awareness is just the first step. The real work begins when we recognize these patterns and actively work to create healthier alternatives. Studies show that organizations that successfully address these dynamics see up to a 25% improvement in collaborative outcomes.
So it's really about building new organizational muscles for handling anxiety and uncertainty.
Exactly that. And remember, every time you catch yourself or your team falling into these patterns, you have an opportunity to choose a different response. That's how real organizational change begins.